Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for sitting through that, and also for the extensive CV that you have. It's almost as long as mine. How many languages do you speak?
More or less one.
Great, and fluent finance. So, as you know, our guest today needs no introduction. A man who's overseen the merger of two huge companies, Dentsu and Aegis. We're talking about $5 billion worth of market capitalization, 36,000 people, and not to mention the huge cultural differences between a Japanese company and also a major European and UK company as well. So it's great to have you on the stage. Let's cut straight to the chase. Consolidation. So you're at the forefront of that, and now we've got what Sir Martin calls POG, which is Publicis and Omnicom Group. Consolidation is the big theme here.
Yeah, it's clearly a big trend, and I think, you know, to some extent, what's driving that trend is the complexity of the business we're in, the advertising and media business. And when you consider the range of services and the key driving forces in the market of you know, globalization and convergence, there is huge demand to provide much more complex range of services, much more technically driven, more technology, more data across the whole ecosystem. And what that means is that agencies are trying to provide holistic services across 28 different specializations.
Do you necessarily get that through acquisitions, sir?
Well, you know, this is more about the major consolidation. So not only do clients want us to deliver holistic and integrated solutions and add value through innovation, socially, mobile, through video and all other media, they want it in 110 markets. So what the consolidation trend has been, the major consolidations, is about getting assets. And then what the competitive environment issue in terms of those big consolidations is how do you organise those assets and how do you build culture in those businesses. And I think that's got a long way to go until
and its footprint, let's face it as well. How's that merger, by the way, going to affect things? Because you go up to the rankings to about number 3 in position.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Dentsu acquisition of Aegis, that's been so far an entirely positive experience. I think in terms of the way it was set up, it was a very strong, geographically complementary you know, merger. Dentsu, 90% of their revenues in Japan, a very large, slightly mysterious company. But you know,
is it still mysterious, by the way?
Much less so for
executive?
Me. Much less so for me, and I can talk a bit about that. But if you like, you know, we're now a group that is geographically complete. In that acquisition, not one redundancy. So if you look at the stakeholders of the shareholders, Aegis shareholders took a 50% premium and left. Dentsu shareholders gained access to high growth outside of Japan, and because of the depreciation of the yen, have got their premium back already. So then you've got the staff, not one redundancy, complementary geographies, and really that enables the business to be integrated quickly. And in fact, as of Jan 1, that integration is done. So it's been quite a simple but enjoyable and extremely positive experience.
So that's the most utopian merger I've ever heard of in my career.
Given its size, the largest merger in the history of advertising up until Publicis Omnicom, I think it has been. And you know, I think the approach the Japanese took, very knowledgeable, very respectful in the way they did it, and absolutely stuck to their word at every stage. It's proved to be extremely positive.
There must have been cultural sensitivities though as well. I mean, taking on the helm of a company like this, where, you know, obviously the business culture in Japan is so different. We've seen Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, talk about this on the stage day in, day out. Give us some anecdotes and insight into the challenges there, because this was a really big acquisition.
Yeah, I think the first one is that what they were very smart about doing is saying, okay, we've got a very big business in Japan. Aegis has been pretty experienced at running a global network. Therefore, we're going to keep the head office for that business in London and put the assets that Dentsu has outside of Japan into those assets to form Dentsu Aegis. So you've got two businesses. You've got Dentsu Aegis, which is everything outside of Japan, which I run with existing head office, the same management team, the same staff, with some additions out of London. Then Dentsu Inc. remains very focused on Japan. And you're right, culturally the businesses are very different.
And your chairman is Japanese.
Chairman's Japanese, yeah. And culturally they're very different. But the values are very similar. And if you think about big international groups, you do work across lots and lots of different cultures, and cultural difference isn't an issue. What is the issue is do you have a common vision, and do you have the same values? And if those do, then the cultural differences are much less of a challenge, and I think that's the case.
Navigating these markets, the reason why I'm homing in on the Japan issue, as Jerry well knows, is because we were recently in Davos together, and there was this very intense, frosty situation between the Chinese and the Japanese. How does that affect a business like yours? Because Dentsu does a lot of business in China. This is a big advertising market.
It's a very good question. I think clearly we all understand the nature of the tension and the dispute over those islands. And if you look at what the business consequences have been, there has been some. You know, China's trade with the rest of the world, I think, has increased by 7% year on year, and it's gone backwards by 5% with Japan. But it's gone backwards 5%, not 50 or 30 or 20, it's 5% only. And Japan remains a very big investor in China. I think in 2012 it was the second largest investor in the world in China, and in 2013 it's still the third largest investor. So you have a sort of underneath the diplomatic issue, you have the economic needs of those businesses and those markets, and I think it's in no one's interest for it to get more than a diplomatic argument because of that sort of trade between the two countries and the whole geopolitical and economic situation in Asia.
Well, the reason why it's quite interesting to get your views about this is because, as we know, there's this Publicis Omnicom deal that's going through the works. China is a notable difficulty for them to get that merger through. You faced similar situations where China tends to be the difficult market to crack and the difficult market to overcome if you've got such a big takeover going on.
It's true, and certainly in the Dentsu takeover of Aegis, the last antitrust authorization we got was in China, and it took quite a long while to get to that stage. And I suspect it will be the same for Publicis Omnicom. I think it's their last outstanding antitrust clearance that they are trying to get. But in the end, in China, the big multinational groups represent maybe slightly more than half the advertising market. So the vast majority of, particularly in the secondary and tertiary cities in China, the big groups aren't present. So in terms of an antitrust issue, I think it's about how that debate goes, how it's positioned, rather than it fundamentally being an issue. And I think it's worth pointing out that when you consider the size of Publicis and Omnicom coming together, it's been quite interesting that there's been no antitrust issues in Europe or the US, and that's fundamentally because that merger isn't disruptive. It's not fundamentally disrupting the market.
But it is huge. I mean, it'll have many of its customers wondering whether there are economies of scale that they can benefit from, or whether there's just no competition in the market for them to get better rates.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you get a very, very big company, is it going to be a steamroller, or is it going to be a sitting target?
What do you think?
Well, I thought you might ask me that. I think what I think is that there's not a great history of creative marketing services business being able to leverage dominance in a market through scale. What I think is that what makes big companies effective is how they're organised, whether they're organised effectively and what their culture is. And clearly what you have in this big merger of Publicis Omnicom is the shareholders are first and foremost potentially the beneficiaries, particularly the Publicis shareholders at this stage. And whilst they're working on that integration to get their 500 million of synergies, they've got the car parked on the hard shoulder changing the wheels, while the rest of the market's going 70 miles an hour in the fast lane. So how quickly they do it will dictate how successful they are, and how quickly they deal with the issues of structural rigidity, multiple cultures, and different organisations, because they will in the end dictate whether they're competitive or not.
Do you think there's a concern, though, broadly speaking, in the advertising space, that we're seeing such colossal mergers going on, that things are just getting so big at the top, that this industry might eventually sort of fragment back down into all the small players later on in 10 years' time?
I think, I don't think it would ever go back to where it was before. I don't think markets do that. I think the fact that there is so much pressure on technology, on data, on real time, that the model is going to be completely different. And there is still a requirement to deliver all of those in a multi-market environment. So I don't ever see the market going back. What I think is the competitive environment will be around who can leverage their assets that they've got, who can deliver effective, holistic solutions in real time to clients in lots of markets. And that's a real challenge. So I think that's where the market's going to go. How do you organise what you've got?
Because it's fascinating to pick your brains about this, because as Petra was just telling us before, you know, you've had your own company, you've been small and nimble, and now you're at the helm of an enormous colossus.
What I think is, you know, over the years as Aegis, we've bought lots of companies, tend to be small, medium-sized bolt-ons. And what you do is you bring a lot of entrepreneurial spirit into the company. If you keep managers past earn-out, you can infuse a company, an agency group, with the energy and the ideas to build a business. Because businesses are fundamentally the same whether they're big or small. The challenges of execution are much more difficult when they're bigger. But fundamentally, you've got to have a vision. Where are you going with a business? You've got to have you know, your values and how do you expect people to behave. You've got to create your culture. And if you want people to follow you, you've got to be going somewhere. So, you know, that's as important in a company of 20 people as it is in a company of 20,000 people.
So speaking of followers and things like that, we've had an enormous week for the social media companies. Twitter, LinkedIn just overnight, Facebook doing tremendously well on mobile, I might add. This puts advertisers in a really interesting space, because these companies aren't just tools for communication, they're actually potential clients as well.
Yeah, I think you know, the key trends in advertising are very much around mobile and social and video. And if the global advertising market, say in 2014, is going to grow at 4.5%, you'll see mobile, social and video growing at 50%. So the consumers are really assimilating you know, the services that are being provided in that space. Everything's going to be mobile, increasingly it's social, and everything's moving to video, and convergence is driving all of that. So, you know, and that in the end will lead to much more e-commerce.
That's volume though. It isn't the ability to monetize it. That's what we're seeing in the social media space.
It is, but you know, as people understand and learn how to use the capabilities and the functionality, then increasingly they'll be able to monetize it. And if you like, the issues that drive e-commerce are you know, trust in the transaction process, the scale and capability of broadband, and where those have been prevalent, you've seen a real growth in e-commerce. And if e-commerce is about 1 trillion today, it will grow to probably 2.5 trillion in the next 3.5 years. So really we're seeing a massive growth of more trust, more access, and if, as you say on Facebook, 300 of their subscribers are mobile only, transaction and e-commerce on mobile will come and will grow very rapidly indeed. Now,
I feel slightly unfair putting you on the spot asking you this question, because I myself have worked in the media space for a number of years and don't know the answer, but how does one monetize it? The opportunity that mobile offers
What,
people.
from a media owner point of view or from an advertiser point of view?
Both points of view.
Well,
What's the secret? Because we're still looking for it, aren't we? Let's be honest, right?
Yeah, I think the monetisation is much more of a media owner issue than an advertiser issue. I mean, the advertisers will engage to the point at which they get a return on their money, and if they don't, they'll go elsewhere. And there may be some level of investment, but I think it's far less material for the advertisers and the agencies than it is for the media owners. But, you know, the reality is, increasingly, we're seeing masses and masses of data falling out of the advertising ecosystem. And if you collect that data, you relate it to sales, you fuse with different data sets, then you're massively improving the efficiency of the whole system. And that is how it works. And
you are, but this is interesting. You're undermining the privacy of the system. Now that's one of the big things that has come out here from NSA, market research. This must loom large in your mind because, you know, when you're marketing to people and advertising, you're collecting data on them.
I think there's two issues there. I think the first issue is giving people your data. Is that an opt-in or an opt-out?
What should it be then?
Well, my view is it should be opt-out because I think that's, you know, people do want to be commercially accessible. If you look at how people behave on social media, 40% of everyone on a social media network follows a brand. So I think the first issue is opt-in or opt-out. If you opt-in, 5% are opt-in, and if you offer them opt-out, 5% are opt-out. So it's a very big question due to how people behave. But what I also think is that different generations have a different view about the privacy of their data. And I think younger generations are far less concerned about it and freely give out their data and don't really see the problem giving out their data.
Until the whole opt-out Facebook issue really comes back and bites them.
Yeah, I mean, you know, clearly there is development in terms of how people use and interact with Facebook and learn behaviour on Facebook, what works best for them. And I think that'll line itself out very quickly.
Let's talk about content curation, considering we're onto the realm of social media. How important is that?
Well, one of the biggest issues in advertising is that the level of content curation and the flexibility of content that's created for advertising hasn't kept up with the opportunities, particularly in the digital media space. And I think one of the biggest challenges for agencies and one of the biggest challenges for advertisers is how they create relevant content in lots of different formats and in lots of different lengths so that it is, you know, appropriate for the medium. And if the two, you know, largest growing opportunities are in short form video and photos, you can see that content and visual content is growing massively. Video through YouTube is growing massively. It's over a third, I think, of all of Google's revenue now. So, you know, that is a big challenge, and it requires a different approach to content curation.
It also requires a multi-stakeholder approach, dare I say it, that dreaded word, because you need the broadband providers to be able to provide you with the video capability, streaming capability on the street, etc. When do you think we'll find the right happy medium?
I think it will develop at different pace in different countries in different ways. And it's difficult to predict precisely where you'll get that happy medium. But if you look at the driving forces behind convergence, they're unstoppable. If you look at the market capitalization of Apple, Microsoft and Google together, that's about 1.5 trillion. That's the market cap. There's this wall of investment money that is driving convergence so that all content can be delivered on all platforms through all devices. And those big infrastructure media owners are driving that to create lifestyles in their own vertical. So there's that wall of money that's driving that, and I think that will mean it will come true sooner rather than later. And
that wall of money and investment is obviously dependent upon the economic horizon. And this brings me to the outlook for 2014. What is your outlook?
We do have a sort of fairly benign outlook going into 2014. I think we see global GDP growing by about 3.2%. Within that, the US, I think, is in a very strong position. They've got a very flexible labour market. Their energy prices are down 40% due to shale gas, and that economy will grow fairly quickly. Within Europe, the UK outside the Eurozone will grow even faster than the current rate of growth we have at the moment. And in Europe, you do have some growth, and fundamentally, the systemic banking crisis is over. There is still a significant overhang of private and public debt in Europe, and probably within Europe, Germany is doing better, Spain is recovering slightly, France going backwards still, and Italy along the bottom in Western Europe. But what that means is we'll have a stable environment, but relatively low growth.
Right, so this is my final question before I open it up to the floor, because I'm sure you'll have some very interesting questions here for our guest, Jerry, today. We have had a recovery. Nascent recovery. It's not creating any jobs though, and if it's not creating any jobs, it's not creating confidence, and that's what advertisers want to see for revenue spending.
It is creating jobs in the UK where you have growth of 2%. Which
is a relatively small market for the global market, especially for a company like...
Not if you're here, it isn't.
Well, no, but globally.
The issue is that if you only have growth of 1%, you're not reducing unemployment. And when you get growth of higher than 1%, then you begin to reduce unemployment. That's the correlation between those two numbers. And I think certainly in Europe, which does have advantages of technological capability and ease of doing business, they have to be much more aggressive about how they drive growth. And they have to liberalise their labour markets, because until they do, you will have that huge problem with unemployment overhanging the economy. And clearly what you see is that advertising growth in Europe is very slow, probably 1% in Western Europe, excluding the UK. And all the growth is coming from faster growing regions, BRIC economies, Mexico, other markets like that, and the US. So you've got all that growth outside, but it's fundamentally, to your point, a Western European issue. Right.
Okay, with that, let's take some questions from the floor. If you could just raise your hand and say where you're from. Anybody interested in asking a question? Fire away. Yeah, sure. Any questions here? Nope. You're terribly popular, I must say.
Well, I'm popular. One or the other.
I will continue then in that case. Let's carry on this discussion about confidence, because it's one of my personal points of interest here. You know, we hear the US President, Barack Obama, get on the podium talking about the recovery in America. In Davos, we heard that things are getting better for the developed world. Really, it's going to be their time in the spotlight. But the American dream, the kind of expectations that people expect from jobs, just really isn't there these days. And that must worry people on the consumer spending end of things.
Well, you know, you have this big debt scenario in many of the developed markets, and that is always going to have an overhang in terms of consumer confidence to spend. What I think, though, is that fundamentally, if you have capitalism, you will have advertising. And if advertising is less than 2% of GDP, it will increase, because they seem to be the two forces that drive advertising in the longer term. What I also think is, if advertising is going to grow by 4.5% this year, it is, relatively speaking, a lead indicator. And let's be very clear, there are many, many opportunities in this changing advertising market. The whole media environment has changed fundamentally. Consumers now spend twice as much time on media than they did 30 years ago. So whilst it's more complex, there's masses of opportunities for businesses in a capitalist environment to grow and compete. And I think that will continue. And probably one of the biggest issues, which I think you're alluding to, is that if there are 4 trillion plus on the balance sheets of big corporates around the world, when are they going to begin to spend that? Yep. So you've had this massive period of balance sheet repair, and now when's that going to be deployed? And that tends to be deployed when business leaders have confidence about the economy. So if confidence is coming back, you get the redeployment of that investment capital, which I think will stimulate more growth.
So as you were saying before, you've had this big merger, you've been digesting that merger, you haven't made any redundancies, but are you going to hire if you feel so confident then?
For sure, yeah, we're hiring all the time, but we tend to be hiring very different people.
Right, so bolt-on acquisitions that will bring on extra staff?
Well, that's slightly separate. Bolt-on acquisitions are there to, you know, infill capability, bring innovation into the group, that happens. But certainly in terms of the profile of the people we're using, because of so many of the developments in the industry, like programmatic, for example, we're employing many more technologically savvy people. If Gartner says you should invest 5% of your revenue in IT, we're probably spending 10%. And that's a massive increase in investment in the areas of technology and the staff that go with that. So
where's the biggest challenge coming from, A, geographically, and also just generally in the global economy?
I think the biggest challenge, certainly from a geographical point of view, remains Western Europe. Outside of Western Europe, you've got a lot of growth, a lot more risk. So you have more volatility, more issues like corruption, difficulty of doing business, and inflexible labour markets. Those remain the challenges for a benign business environment. I think in terms of our business, the advertising business, what the challenges are is how we can actually manifest all of these different opportunities and all of these changes in this sort of drive towards social and mobile and video and transaction, and actually create competitive advantage so that our businesses can stand out from each other and add value to our clients. And that's a big challenge in a high cost environment.
Anybody want to ask a question on any of these points? In the front row, thanks.
I'm Martina Lacey from C Squared. I wanted to ask you about programmatic a bit more, which you just mentioned there briefly. Okay. A couple of the other networks have been quite aggressive in terms of setting benchmarks of what they want to deliver. For example, media brands wanting 50% by 2015. What's that looking like inside of your business?
I think the first thing to say about programmatic from our own parochial point of view is we don't target or force clients to do it. But the reality is, the reason why programmatic exists is because humans can't do it anymore. You can't plan and buy media over 50,000 sites as a human being. So you need technology to do it. And programmatic is an innovation that adds value. If you input the right data sets and have the right insight going into that programmatic approach, then there is fantastic value to be gained in doing that because there's too much inventory. So you have to access the right inventory. So it's a fact. It's going to grow 20-fold over the next 5 years, without a doubt. Different approaches from different agency groups, I agree. Ours is voluntary only. But the reality is it's going to grow even more, and it does add a lot of value if you do it the right way. Importantly, clients need to hold on to the rights of their first-party data. You know, Data is critical. We have dozens and dozens of data sets. Clients have their sales data and their consumer data. They have to keep that and own that. And I don't think we should be pushing them to do anything other than own their own data and benefit from that being fused and combined to the data that we have to drive programmatic.
And how is that going to shape what the people look like within your group?
I think it was sort of a little bit the answer I gave before the question, actually, which is about more people who have technological skills. So many more tech people who know how to, if you like, twiddle the knobs to make that system work better, is an additional specialisation. But actually, if you look at the suite of talent we have at the moment, we have 28 different specialists just in the media environment. So it's not new, it is changing, and there's a lot of very smart young people out there who are extremely good at it.
But harnessing the world of big data, this sort of big future of big data where people imagine gargantuan reels of amounts of information out there, it must take up quite a bit of your time at the helm of a company to think, how can I navigate this space?
Yes and no. I think the reality is if you take the data sets you've got and you understand how to fuse them with each other to get the right answers, it's relatively easy. And if you take all the data that's available, I don't know what the percentage is, but 2% is used effectively. If you could drive that to 4% used effectively or 6% is used effectively, then you're getting massive improvements. And I think it'll be an iterative process to do that over time.
So an ongoing amelioration. Any more questions? In the front row, thanks.
Hi, Mike Tateman from Soho Syndicate. We talked about programmatic, owned content, social media. If you were to be giving some advice, possibly unrequested or otherwise, to a media owner as to how to stay in as connected as possible to brands and their kind of new brand and communications, what would that advice be?
I think my advice would be is that what agencies are doing is trying to provide holistic solutions across a number of different channels, leveraging an ecosystem. And if media owners are able to provide much more comprehensive, integrated packages across their assets that are really usable, that are charged on the basis of adding value to your clients, then I think that's a real progress. So if you can support the complex environment the agencies are in and actually deliver more integrated packages, I think that's a good opportunity to not find yourself in the race to the bottom.
Any more questions before we wrap it up for the day? Front back.
Jerry, quick question about the Dentsu Aegis Group and the differentiation you've driven predominantly in media at the moment. What's next? Are you looking at other areas of the business that, I mean, Dentsu obviously have creative capabilities in Japan. Is there anything you can tell us about how that will develop across the rest of the world?
I think we do have plans. We will continue to do small and medium-sized bolt-on acquisitions, which help drive innovation and growth in the business. Since the deal completed on March 26th of last year, we've done 25, so that will continue at a pace. Whether we drive hard into other areas, we are taking a view or have some views already, and I think probably if I look at where we are, so if you've got WPP and Publicis Omnicom Group and then Dentsu Aegis underneath, and what I say underneath, we don't have the same market share they have, but what we do have the ability is if you like to be in the Goldilocks position, big enough to compete, but not too big that we can't grow. So we'll be looking to be different and better, and everything we'll do will be framed around that approach to a strategy of being in the Goldilocks position and very focused on all our stakeholders.
Any more questions?
Nigel Gwilliam from the IPA. I'm just curious about the issue of data and privacy. And there were, earlier on in the conversation, there appeared to be a conflation between the issue of NSA type data inquisition versus that which takes place within the advertising industry. Do you think as an industry we suffer from that perception? Because really we don't have the capacity or the desire to be as invasive as that.
I think that's absolutely right. I think many of us are not entirely clear of our position in every area in relation to data, and I think as it becomes a much more data-rich environment, and we are, if you like, taking the information from cookies and using that, then it does become much more conflictual. The reality, of course, in terms of data regulation is you have different regulations in different parts of the world. The EU regulations are very different from the regulations in the US. So, until there's some commonality of regulation in terms of data privacy, that'll always be an open issue. And again, I go back to the point that my view is that it will become less as an issue as time goes on. And clearly, if brands operate irresponsibly with the data they have, that will damage their brand equity and their brand image. And we're now in a completely transparent environment where how brands behave is seen visibly and acted on by consumers. So if there's misuses of data in any way, that will have a very negative effect on equity. In fact, most of the advertisers that I talk to are very focused and very keen to ensure that they use the data in a highly responsible way.
Do you communicate that message? Presumably your industry does communicate that message quite heavily towards heads of state in the EU, towards people in the United States, because this is a theme that comes up time and time again. You want to hear more harmonization of data privacy and protection laws from consumers and companies' point of view.
Well, it's been a big issue at Davos in recent years, as I'm sure you know. And there are industry bodies within all markets that are looking at that issue. But I think there are some different points of view, but I think that's our point of view, and I think that point of view is probably common with many in the industry. All
right, now I'm about to wrap things up because I'm aware that we're finished for our time. But could I just ask you, I asked Mr. Maurice Levy in that very seat this time last year, you know, what was next on the cards for him? He said, well, I'm no longer going to be the CEO of Publicis. I took that to mean that he was going to step down, but of course it turns out that he's going to swallow another enormous company and become the CEO of that instead. What's next for you?
Well, listen, I'm not 12 months into my role, so I'm very early in my role. The important thing for me is to lead the group that I run, to make sure they're very clear about what's expected of them, to drive them to be very competitive, to create a vision for them that works, and that's what I'm going to do for the foreseeable future. So I think I'm going to be boring for a little while yet.
Great. Well, you haven't been a boring guest. Thank you very much there, Jerry Buhlman.
Thank you.